Remember when I was a kid, there was this magazine that they would give us in school called the Highlights magazine. Some of you may have seen it as well. And it had this picture in it called What's Wrong? And when you looked at the picture, there were a lot of things that were wrong, and you could circle them or find them. This is an example. Like, for example, there's a horse in the second-story window. That's not right. And then there's this water puddle with a kid ice skating across the water puddle with a fish in it in the middle of the street, and the cake is upside down. The toy sign is upside down. There's a bear with a unicorn. If you really pay attention to the details, the little boy there with the blue hat on has one long sleeve and one short sleeve. And just the longer you look at it, the more you realize what's actually wrong with the picture and how everything is completely out of order. Well, for the last couple of weeks, we've been going through the story of Jonah. And in the story of Jonah, that's basically the way that the story has gone. Everything has been out of order. There's this prophet of God that God told to go, and this prophet of God said no. He didn't want to go. He gets on this boat and he meets these pagan sailors, and they're way more religious and spiritually focused than he is. They prayed long before Jonah did. They're more concerned with obeying God. Some of you are so fixated on this image, it is hilarious. You're trying to figure out, you haven't heard a word I've said since that picture popped up, and that's okay. Maybe you're back with me now. Anyways, let me just summarize what I just said. The story of Jonah is completely upside down. And today we're going to get to the part of the story, fish that is going to swallow Jonah. And you would think that being swallowed by a fish would lead to death. But in reality, this situation is going to lead to Jonah finding life. And when you get to this part of the story, this becomes a part of the story that a lot of people have a hard time swallowing. How in the world can a man be swallowed by a fish and live? Well, I want to give you this idea just to address that real quick. If this is the part of the story that gives you a hard time, it might be because you have a small view of God. The big fish is only a problem if you have this small view of God and what he can do. I want to remind you of what David prayed. 1 Chronicles 29, he said, "Yours, O Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the victory and the majesty, for all that is in the heavens and in the earth is yours. Yours is the kingdom, O Lord, and you are exalted as head above all." So today, I want us to think about what we can learn from this prayer that Jonah prays from this fish, and how his life is going to completely turn itself around. Now, have you ever looked through some children's Bibles around the story of Jonah? Like, there are some crazy ideas that come out of children's Bibles when it comes to the story of Jonah. One that is my absolute favorite. By favorite, I mean like so ridiculous in what it's going to teach, but I find it really hilarious because here is this guy in the belly of a fish, and the most ridiculous part to me is honestly not the fire cooking a meal in the belly of the fish. That's not the most ridiculous part. The most ridiculous part is Jonah wearing a toboggan. I mean, why is he wearing a toboggan in the belly of a fish? And it's just this reminder that sometimes we romanticize this part of Jonah's story, or we go to these leaps and bounds to try to explain how in the world could a man survive in the belly of a fish for 3 days. Let's just suffice it to say, if God can create humans out of the dust of the ground, then he has the ability to allow a person to survive in the belly of a fish. And no, I do not believe it was some open type of cave where Jonah could have cooked some dinner had he gotten hungry in that amount of time. This is a real story. He is in the belly of a real fish. And there's nothing romantic or fantasy-wise about it. He's there and it stinks. He's smelling nothing but the aroma of fish carcass. He's probably going in and out of consciousness. He's probably vomiting on a very regular basis. And somehow in all of this, he has the awareness to pray. In his prayer, he thinks he's about to die, but he recognizes that he's actually going to live. And it's through his prayer in the dark that he finds some very powerful truths that we need to remind ourselves as well. The first one is that God, even when you are in the fish, God, somebody may have to help me. I think my clicker went dead or something's up. I'll just talk and won't worry about the screen. There we go. They can change it for us. God still listens. Think about this now. Here's Jonah who says from the belly of the fish, and he describes it, if you paid attention to what Jackson read, as going down to Sheol. Now, Sheol was the place that they thought is where the dead people went, and they believed that it was underneath the water, under the earth. And you got to imagine, here's Jonah, and he's in the belly of this fish, and he recognizes this fish is taking a descent down farther underneath the water. And he pictures himself going down into the pit of the dead. And he recognizes that even there, God is still listening. Now think about how amazing this is, that from the very pit of death, from the deepest part of that water, God heard his prayer. And it just reminds us, it doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter what is going on in your life. Your prayer still ascends to the very throne room of God. Even if what you are going through is the result of your own disobedience and foolishness, when you lift your voice to the heavens, God listens. The very Bible opens with God speaking. And then after that, he listens, and he stoops his ear down to us, and he listens to what we have to say. Now, a couple of weeks ago, there were a couple of cell phone carriers that had a loss in signal, and maybe that was some of you, and your phone just went on SOS mode, which basically means it's worth absolutely nothing but a paperweight. You couldn't do anything with it. You were taken back to the 90s, and you were just reminded of what life was like well before we had cell phones. I forgot to drop this picture in, but if you remember the show, The Little House on the Prairie, there was a great meme, if you saw that, about what life is like as an AT&T customer, and your whole life was disrupted. You had no idea whether or not you were going to survive. You didn't know if your service was ever going to come back. You couldn't check text. You couldn't check social media. Your phone wouldn't call. You just didn't know if you were going to make it. And it's just this reminder that even when our cell phones lose their connection, it doesn't matter what's going on in our life, our connection with God is never broken. Regardless of whether or not we're responsible for our own circumstances, our connection with him never breaks. The second truth that Jonah learned is that God still reigns. I read this story about this Native American tribe that had this unique ritual that they would have their young man go through on the night of their 13th birthday. They would take this young man deep into the forest, miles into the forest, and they would blindfold him, and there they would leave him all night long. And when he took off the blindfold, all he would see was darkness. And you got to imagine being in that deep forest all night long, being the first time he's ever been away from his family and from his tribe. That every time there's a twig that snapped, he's wondering, is this an animal coming to attack him? Every noise he hears, every animal that he hears howling, he's wondering, is this going to be it? And all night long, he's living in complete fear, unable to really see anything. Until finally, at the very break of dawn, light begins to break through into the forest. And as light breaks through into the deep forest, he begins to see all the flowers and all the trees and even a path that was there the entire time. But what was the most disruptive is that as light would begin to dawn, he would see the figure of a man just a few feet away. And that man had a bow and arrow. And as enough light came up, he could see that that man was his very own father who had been there all night long, watching over him. It's just this reminder to us that sometimes when we go through difficult situations, we wonder, God, where are you? God, why are you distant from me? Yet God still reigns. God is where he has always been. He's sitting on his throne, completely aware of everything that we're going through. And it's not that God is distant or silent or indifferent. He's present. And he's not too busy or too distracted to know what you're going through. He's there. Even in the belly of the fish, God is there. The third thing that Jonah learned is that God still delivers. It's just the way that God delivers, one of the most challenging concepts that we could ever imagine. Now, Jonah was really hoping hoping that his life would just come to an end. They threw him overboard. He was hoping that that was going to be it. He was totally content to the fact and settled with the fact that he was going to sink down under the water and drown. In fact, his life was slipping away. But God wasn't finished with Jonah yet. In fact, God sent that fish to swallow Jonah to save him because God had a greater purpose for him. It's just this reminder that God delivers through death into life. And the way that God does that doesn't make any sense. And so this fish, if we were to read it in the original language, one of the things you would notice is that the way the fish is first described when it first swallows Jonah is that the fish is male. It's referred to as a male fish. It's given male pronouns and adjectives. But then as Jonah is in the belly of the fish changes and the fish is given female pronouns and adjectives. And it's this weird little change to remind us what was a tomb, that Joseph thought was a tomb, has now become a womb. And when you think about that in the greater reality of what that means for us, it's just this reminder of who Jesus is. Because we often can wonder, how in the world, God, can you save people through death? How can a man give his life on a cross and be placed in a tomb, and that bring about the rescuing and salvation of all humankind? The same way that a man being swallowed by a fish can lead to his salvation is the same way that a man being hung on a cross and being laid in a tomb can lead to life for all who would follow him. And then there's this reminder that in our baptism, Paul describes it in Romans 6 as connecting us to the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And somehow in this spiritual grave of baptism, being lowered into the water and spiritually being placed in a tomb, that according to John chapter 3, it becomes this ritual of new birth. And the tomb becomes a womb where we are delivered to new life. Where Jonah was spit out, we are raised up to walk in newness of life. God delivers, just not necessarily in ways that we think he will. So I want to leave you with 3 things you need to do if you ever find yourself in the fish. If you ever find yourself living in a situation, especially if it's from your own doing and you don't know what to do. 3 things that Jonah did. Number 1, you need to pray. We've already said it. It doesn't matter where you are, what you are going through. God hears the prayers of his children who are in desperate situations. There's this passage in Jeremiah chapter 33 and thrown into prison because he was speaking out against his nation's leaders because they weren't living the right way and doing the right thing. And he finds himself in prison and he doesn't know what to do. He's desperate. And here's what comes back to him. It says, the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah a second time. And here's the word that came back to Jeremiah sitting in prison. The Lord who made the earth, the Lord who forms it to establish it. The Lord is his name, says this. The very first thing that God reminds Jeremiah of sitting in prison is of his own power. Of his reminder to Jeremiah, I know that's where you are. Trust in my power. Then he says, call to me and I will answer you. Call out to me because he hears every cry from his children. Now there's this reminder that we need to have in mind that just because you're in a desperate situation and you call out with a desperate plea does not mean it's going to result in an instant solution. And when you cry out to him, you're going to have to be a little patient. You're going to have to trust God because there are certain consequences that may have to play out. You just need to remember that God is aware of everything that you are going through. And as one writer said, the measure of your faith will always be the measure of your God. You will never have a faith that is strong until you have a vision of how strong God is. So call out to him. Secondly, you need to remember. Now, all throughout the book of Deuteronomy, God would constantly remind his people who had just come out of Egypt and had wandered through the wilderness for an entire generation. He'd constantly remind them that they were used to be slaves in Egypt, and he had delivered them. And he wasn't doing that to hold that over their head to say, look at how awesome I am, and you just surrender to me because I would crush you if you don't. He doesn't do that. He reminds them of who they were, to remind them of his power and his protection and his provision in their life. To remind them that when they are in a desperate moment, they need to remember all of the times and all the ways that God had delivered them before, and all of the crazy ways that God had delivered them before. You see, for Jonah, he never expected the fish to be his deliverance, but it was. That's how God chose to rescue him and to save him from something else. It's just a reminder to us that sometimes God sends these really strange acts of grace into our life. What seemed like a crushing moment, what seemed so overwhelming, what seemed like there's no way any good's going to come out of this, somehow becomes this strange act of grace and deliverance. I don't know what yours is, but I'll give you one or two examples. Maybe it was the loss of a job that in the moment seemed like the worst thing that could have ever happened, but it actually made you more aware of what was going on in your life and aware of the people that were around you that it was causing you to overlook. And it led you to something far greater that you would have never experienced had that not worked out. Maybe it was some other struggle, physically, emotionally, spiritually, that at the time you said, this is too much, I can't get through this. But yet God brought you through, maybe through a person you never met or expected, or this situation or moment in your life. And it just kind of came out of nowhere. And looking back on it, you now see that that was what God used to teach you and to deliver you. And it was this strange act of grace that looking back on it, you're now thankful for it. But living in it, you're thinking, God, get me out of this. But now you have a great story to tell. And so it's important to look back and to remember all the ways that he has guided us through, even and especially those moments that we created the difficulty for ourselves, because he's present with us and he wants to remind us of his power and provision in our life. Thirdly, this one might be a little weird, but when you're in the fish, you should worship. It's exactly what Jonah did. He busted out in song. He prayed. He worshiped. And the reason why it's important to worship when you're in the fish, and in the fish is just a metaphorical situation. I'm not going to assume if you're ever eaten by the fish, you're going to live to tell about it. Maybe. If so, you probably should write a prayer and record it for all of God's people, because that's going to be worth sharing. But when you're living in that moment that seems so destructive and overwhelming, you need to worship. Because what worship will do is it will change your perspective. Allow you to learn lessons that you can only learn that God is teaching by worshiping. Because in that moment, you won't be reminded as you worship of how big your problems are. You'll be reminded of how big your God is. You'll be reminded that no matter what you're going through, God is greater than all of it. And you'll be reminded that the story of Jonah does not end in the fish. The story of Jonah doesn't end in the darkness. And your story and mine doesn't end in the difficulty. It ends in victory. It ends with more opportunities to serve the Lord. This morning, I want to close with one of the grossest verses in all the Bible. Can we do that today? And I know it's right before lunch, and I'm really sorry for what you're about to read, but it's from God's word. You got to take it up with the Lord, not with me. Here's what it says. It says, the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah on the dry ground. Sorry to get you to think about that. But we need to think about this line that's underlined. The Lord commanded the fish. The Lord was in control of the fish. The Lord was in control of one of the strangest acts of grace ever experienced. And the Lord is in control of whatever it is that you're going through and that I'm going through. And he will see us to the other side. He will deliver us out of that tomb through a womb into new life. And as you get to the other side, you might just be covered in fish mucus, but you've survived. And you've got a great story to share, to tell someone else of how God delivered you through the strangest way possible, because he's brought you through to give you a second chance. Next week, we're going to look at what is Jonah going to do with this second chance, this opportunity at new life. Today, God offers us the same opportunity to new life. He's in command and in control of everything that we are experiencing. And he will bring you through to the other side. In the meantime, living in the fish is not a great place to live, but it's a great place to learn about the very power and presence of the Lord. And one of the questions that we need to ask ourselves when we're living in the fish is there an area of pain in my life that I have not invited God into yet? It's exactly what was going on in Jonah's heart. There was an area of pain that he'd not invited the Lord into yet. But it was in the fish that opened his heart and his mind to recognize what was going on in his own heart and to surrender that to the Lord. And so that's what I want you to ask yourself today. And maybe a question you're going to have to ask yourself over the course of this week. As you unpack what's going on in your life, and you say, God, there's places in my heart I haven't, but I need to. I need to surrender those places of hurt to you, because God is the only one who can bring healing. He's the only one who can rescue you through it and to bring you out on the other side. And yeah, it's going to be messy. There's no doubt about that. But on the other side is healing, is his divine presence and protection. On the other side is new life. Because as we sang this morning, as Jonah prayed, salvation belongs to our God. So if you're here this morning and you're ready to receive the salvation of the Lord, we've got some water that will start as a tomb as you're buried in Christ, that will become a womb as you're raised up to new life. And what greater way to celebrate new life today than to see someone baptized? If you're here today, there's just been a lot that's going on in your life, pain you haven't invited God into yet. I want to encourage you to surrender that today. Surrender it to the Lord as we sing in just a moment. Invite him in to work in what's going on in your life and in your heart. I want to invite you to maybe share that with one of our shepherds who will be up front and in the back, where they can pray over you and encourage you and walk with you. And we'll pause as a congregation if you would like us to. Just encourage you and pray for you. Take you before the throne of the Father, who listens to every prayer and cry from his children, especially when they find themselves in desperate situations. If there's something going on in your life that we can encourage you with today, please let us know as together we stand and sing.